Before you decide this is just another forest horror story, there's something you need to understand first. We didn't discover the silent shadows by accident. We didn't stumble into them, and we were never unprepared. We were already warned. Those warnings just weren't written anywhere the public could read. My name is Ethan Cole. I've been a forest ranger for 13 years, working in a protected woodland most people think of as peaceful, quiet, and safe. To hikers, it's calming. To campers, it's beautiful. To rangers, it's monitored, because silence in a forest is not normal. Every forest has sound, wind moving through leaves, birds calling to each other, insects filling the empty spaces. Even at night there is always something, unless something is wrong. During my first week on the job, my supervisor handed me a map and said something that didn't sound like training at all. If the forest ever goes quiet in a way you can feel in your chest, he said, you leave immediately. No investigating, no documenting, just leave. I laughed. He didn't. That was the first warning. The second warning came from old incident reports. Thin folders labeled resolved even though nothing inside them had ever been resolved. Missing hikers, hunters who never came back. Search teams that returned early without explanation. In the margins of those reports, written in different handwriting across decades, was the same note. Shadows observed. No sound. We call them silent shadows because that's the only honest name we have. They don't move leaves. They don't break branches. They don't make noise. You never hear them arrive. You only realize the forest has stopped responding to you. The first time I encountered one, I didn't see it. I felt it. It was early autumn, just before sunset. When the light flattens and distances become hard to judge. I was checking trail markers along a low-traffic loop, radio on, visibility clear. Then every bird went silent, not gradually, not fading away, instantly. I slowed without meaning to. The air felt heavier, not thick, not cold, just aware. That's when the ground noise disappeared. No crunch of boots, no rustle of fabric. I was still walking, but the forest wasn't reacting. That was the moment the warning made sense. I didn't turn around. I didn't call out. I walked back the way I came, steady and controlled, pretending nothing was wrong. Behind me, my shadow stretched in the wrong direction. Not longer, angled, as if something else was blocking the light where nothing should have been standing. I didn't look. That's another rule. If you acknowledge them, they acknowledge you back. The moment I reached the ranger road, sound returned. Wind, insects, my own breathing. I filed a normal report, nothing unusual. That night, my supervisor read it and nodded. First one? He asked. I nodded. They're getting closer to the trails, he said. Used to stay deeper in. That was the third warning. Over the years, patterns became clear. Silent shadows appeared during specific light conditions. Dusk, dawn, heavy overcast. They don't cross open ground. They don't chase. They wait. People who disappear near them aren't attacked. They simply stop moving forward. Search teams find abandoned backpacks, unfinished campsites, footprints that end cleanly, like the person decided standing still was enough. The worst part? They don't choose everyone. They choose people who hesitate, people who pause to listen, people who feel the silence and try to understand it instead of leaving. That's why we warn new rangers. Not with fear, with rules. If the forest becomes quiet in a way that feels intentional, we tell them, don't be brave, don't observe, don't help, leave, because the silent shadows don't attack. They replace motion with stillness. And once you accept that stillness, you never leave the forest at all. The first ranger who ignored the warning didn't do it out of arrogance. That's important to understand. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He was tired. His name was Mark Holloway, and he'd been on the job longer than I had. 17 years in the forest, reliable, methodical, the kind of ranger who followed rules. Until one night when the rules felt unnecessary. It happened in late October during a stretch of overcast days when the sun never really showed itself. That kind of light matters more than you'd think. Mark was assigned a late patrol near the Western Ridge, an area with long sight lines and no major trails. Low risk, routine. At 6:41 p.m., He checked in on the radio. "All clear," he said. "Quiet night." Those were the last normal words he ever spoke. At 6:58 p.m., he radioed again. His voice sounded calm, too calm. "Do you ever notice," he said slowly, "how quiet it gets out here when everything lines up just right?" Dispatch asked him to clarify. There was a pause. Then Mark laughed softly. "Never mind," he said. "It's probably nothing." The transmission ended. 10 minutes later, his GPS stopped moving. Not lost signal. Stopped. We didn't send anyone in that night. That decision still sits heavy with me, but it was the right one. You don't search for a ranger in silence. You wait for sound to return. At first light, 3 of us went in together. Mark's truck was parked exactly where it should have been. Engine cold. Keys still inside. His boots were on the ground near the tree line, placed neatly, not abandoned, placed. There were no signs of a struggle, no dragged marks, no broken branches. The forest looked untouched. That's what made it wrong. We found his flashlight 20 yards in, turned off, lying on its side. No footprints beyond that point, just clean ground. As if Mark had decided to stop walking. We searched for hours, found nothing. By noon, the forest felt normal again, too normal. The report listed him as missing, presumed deceased. But we didn't mourn him the way people mourn the dead, because no one who truly disappears near the silent shadows is ever fully gone. 2 weeks later, something happened that none of us were prepared for. Mark came back. He walked out of the tree line near the old fire road at 7:12 a.m., just after sunrise. No injuries, no visible confusion, same uniform, same posture. But something about him was incomplete. "Morning," he said, like he'd just returned from a coffee break. We rushed him to the station. Medical checks showed nothing wrong. No dehydration, no hypothermia, no trauma. But when I asked him where he'd been, his answer made my stomach drop. "I stayed," he said. I asked him what he meant. He thought carefully before responding. "The forest needed me to stop moving," he said, "so I did." He didn't describe fear. He didn't describe darkness. He described relief. "It's easier when you don't fight it," Mark said. "The silence makes things simple." That sentence broke something in the room. We placed him on administrative leave. Psych evaluations followed. Doctors used words like dissociation and stress response. They didn't explain why Mark refused to go near the trees anymore, or why he flinched when the wind stopped suddenly, or why he insisted on sleeping with a radio turned on. Before he left town, Mark said one last thing to me. "I almost didn't come back," he said quietly. "Not because I couldn't," he looked at the forest through the station window, "but because staying felt right." That's when we updated the warnings, not officially, not on paper. We added a sentence we only say out loud. If the silence feels comforting, we tell new rangers, "You're already too close." Mark didn't last long after that. He transferred, moved somewhere loud, busy. Cities are safer for people who've learned what silence can do. The silent shadows didn't chase him. They didn't need to. They'd already shown him the alternative. And once you understand how easily motion can be replaced by stillness, you spend the rest of your life afraid of quiet, what the silent shadows actually are. For a long time, we avoided asking what the silent shadows were, not because we didn't want answers, because every time someone tried to define them, they got closer than they should have. Names give things edges, understanding gives them shape. And whatever lives in the silence doesn't like being shaped. What we do know didn't come from theories or guesses. It came from patterns, from what happened before the forest went quiet, and what happened after it let someone go. The silent shadows aren't creatures in the way people imagine monsters. They don't hunt, they don't stalk, they don't chase prey. They wait for the forest to stop performing. That's the best way I can explain it. Most of the time, the forest reacts to us. Footsteps echo, branches snap, animals scatter. We move, and the environment responds. But sometimes, rarely deliberately, the forest decides not to respond at all. That's when the silent shadows exist. They aren't inside the forest. They are what's left when the forest stops acknowledging you. This realization came after Mark's return, when we started reviewing older ranger journals that never made it into official archives. Handwritten logs, loose pages, personal notes hidden in lockers. One entry, dated 1961, stood out. The shadow wasn't darker than the forest. It was emptier, like a missing reaction. That line changed everything. Silent shadows don't block light, they block response. They form in places where sound, movement, and attention collapse inward. That's why they don't appear everywhere. They show up in areas where the land has been overused and abandoned. Old logging cuts, burned scars, places where people took everything and left nothing but quiet behind. The forest remembers those places differently. We also learned why they don't cross open ground. Open space requires reaction. Wind moves freely. Light shifts constantly. Silence can't stabilize there. But in dense woods, where sound should echo and movement should matter, the absence becomes noticeable. That's where they wait. The most disturbing discovery came from analyzing when people disappeared, not the time of day. The moment. Every recorded incident happened during hesitation. Someone stopping to check a map, someone pausing to listen, someone slowing down because the quiet felt important. The silent shadows don't force you to stop. They offer you the option. That's the mistake most people make. They think danger announces itself. It doesn't. The silence feels neutral at first, then calming, then reasonable. By the time it feels comforting, the forest has already stopped reacting to you. That's when your shadow stops behaving like it should. We tested this carefully, never intentionally, but when a ranger felt the silence coming, we'd ask them to note their shadow before retreating. The reports were consistent. Shadows angled wrong. Shadows stretching toward areas without light. Shadows overlapping with other shadows that didn't belong to anything visible. No two reports describe the same shape, because the silent shadows aren't a single thing. They're a condition, a state where motion, sound, and attention collapse into stillness. Mark explained it best before he left. When I stopped moving, he said, "It felt like the forest finally caught up to me." That sentence made me sick, because it implied something we didn't want to admit. The forest isn't passive. It tolerates us as long as we keep moving, as long as we pass through, as long as we don't linger. The silent shadows are what happens when the forest notices someone slowing down enough to be absorbed. That's why acknowledging them matters. When you look for them, when you try to observe, you're already negotiating. You're asking the forest to respond again. And sometimes it does, not with sound, not with movement, but by letting you stay. That's why we don't investigate. That's why we don't document encounters in detail. And that's why the warnings are simple. If the forest goes quiet in a way that feels intentional, we say, "You're not alone anymore." We don't explain further, because explanation requires curiosity, and curiosity is hesitation. The silent shadows don't take people who run. They don't take people who panic. They take people who stop to understand. The trail we closed without an explanation. The first time the silent shadows appeared on a populated trail, W.E. knew containment had failed. Up until then, they stayed in forgotten places, dead-end loops, old cuts, areas only rangers and locals ever walked. That trail wasn't supposed to be like that. It was Pine Hollow Loop, wide, well-marked, family-friendly, the kind of trail we recommended to visitors who wanted a safe forest experience. That changed on a Saturday in early October. Perfect weather, clear skies, dozens of hikers spread out across the loop. At 4:38 p.m., the first call came in. A couple reported that the forest felt wrong. Not dangerous, not scary, just quiet. Dispatch logged it as anxiety and moved on. At 4:52 p.m., a second call came in. This time from a group of college students. They said the birds had stopped and their footsteps didn't sound right. One of them laughed on the phone. "I know this sounds stupid," he said, "but it feels like we're walking in a picture." That sentence made my stomach drop. At 5:01 p.m., all sound sensors along Pine Hollow flatlined, not malfunctioned, went to zero. That doesn't happen naturally. We shut the trail down immediately. No public explanation, no alerts. We sent 3 rangers in, together, while there was still daylight. The moment we crossed the trailhead, the forest felt contained, not hostile, compressed, like everything was holding its breath. We found the first group standing still near a bend in the trail. 4 people, all awake, all calm. None of them noticed us approach. They were staring at nothing. I said their names, no response. I waved a hand in front of one woman's face. She blinked slowly, like waking from deep sleep. "Oh," she said, "did it start already?" I asked her what she meant. She frowned. "The quiet," she said, "it feels like the right time." We moved them out quickly. Once they crossed the boundary, sound slammed back into place. Birds ear up. Ted. Wind returned. One of the students started crying immediately. Another threw up. The last hiker we found wasn't as lucky. He was alone, standing just off the trail. His backpack sat neatly at his feet. His shadow stretched behind him, but not from the sun, from something inside the trees. We didn't touch him, that's another rule. You don't touch someone who's already stopped moving. We spoke to him instead. His name was Aaron Wilkes. He answered questions slowly. Yes, no, I think so. When I asked him if he wanted to leave, he hesitated. That hesitation almost cost him everything. The forest leaned in, not visually, emotionally. I felt the silence try to settle on me. I raised my voice and said his name sharply. "Now," I said, "move now." Something broke. Aaron gasped like he'd been underwater. He stumbled forward. The silence shattered. Later, Aaron told us what happened while he stood there. He didn't see shadows. He didn't hear voices. He felt a suggestion. This is where you stop. Not because you're tired, not because you're afraid, because movement suddenly feels unnecessary. That night, we closed Pine Hollow Loop permanently. No press release, no signage explaining why, just a simple notice. Trail closed. Maintenance. People complained. They always do. They don't like unexplained boundaries. What they don't understand is that explanation invites curiosity. And curiosity is how the forest notices you. After Pine Hollow, the silent shadows didn't retreat. They adjusted. They learned what proximity felt like. They learned how many people it took before someone would hesitate. That was the moment we realized something worse. The forest wasn't just tolerating us anymore. It was experimenting. And we were running out of places to close quietly. The child who noticed them first. Adults notice danger when something changes. Children notice danger when something feels wrong. That's why what happened next terrified us more than any missing person ever had. It was a school field trip. That alone should tell you how badly things had shifted. The trail wasn't Pine Hollow, it was Maple Run, a short educational path just inside the forest boundary. Wide, flat, safe. At least it used to be. 2 teachers, 1 volunteer parent, 12 children between the ages of 8 and 10. I was assigned to walk with them for the afternoon. It was mid-October, overcast, but bright enough. At first everything felt normal. Birds, wind, laughter. Then one of the kids, Emily, stopped walking. She didn't panic. She didn't cry. She just stood there staring into the trees. "Emily?" Her teacher said, "Keep up, honey." Emily didn't respond. I stepped closer and crouched down beside her. "What's wrong?" I asked gently. She looked at me and asked a question no child should ever think to ask. Why did the forest stop listening to us? My stomach dropped. The birds had gone quiet. Not slowly, all at once. I stood up immediately. "Everyone," I said calmly, louder than necessary. "We're turning around now." One of the parents laughed nervously. "Is this part of the lesson?" she asked. "No," I said. "It's not." Emily tugged on my sleeve. "They don't like grown-ups noticing," she whispered. "But they don't mind when kids do." I didn't ask her how she knew. You don't question instinct in moments like that. We started moving. Slowly at first, then faster. Behind us, the quiet thickened. The children didn't seem scared. That was the worst part. They walked calmly, obediently, like staying would have felt just as reasonable. Emily stayed close to me. "They're not hiding," she said quietly. "They're waiting." I glanced at the trees. Shadows stretched where the light shone. "Don't allow them. Not darker." Empty. We reached the trailhead just as sound slammed back into place. Birds exploded into noise. Wind rushed through the leaves. One of the teachers sat down and started shaking. The kids looked confused, except Emily. She looked disappointed. Later, when I spoke to her parents, they thought she'd had an overactive imagination. They asked if she needed counseling. I didn't disagree. But before they left, Emily looked back at me. "They'll try again," she said. "October isn't finished." That night, we reviewed every incident involving children. There weren't many. That's what made it worse. The few that existed had one thing in common. Kids noticed the silence before adults did. They felt it as absence, not fear. Adults tried to explain it away. Children didn't need explanations. That's when we realized the silent shadows weren't learning how to take people. They were learning how people learn. Children adapt faster. They don't resist stillness. They accept it. That made them dangerous, not as targets, but as observers. The next morning we updated the protocols again. No school trips in October, no youth programs near the forest boundary, no exceptions. Publicly, it was framed as seasonal safety. Privately, we all understood the truth. The forest was no longer waiting for mistakes. It was paying attention, and worse, it was listening when the silence followed us home. For as long as we'd been dealing with the silent shadows, there was one rule we believed would always protect us. They stayed in the forest. Not the trails, not the towns, not the roads. The forest was the boundary. That belief died in October, 3 days after the school trip. It started with a call from dispatch at 9:14 p.m. A resident reported that their neighborhood was too quiet. Not suspicious activity, not an emergency, just quiet. I almost dismissed it. Then the dispatcher added something that made my skin crawl. "She says her dog won't stop staring at the trees," he told me, "and she says the shadows don't line up with the streetlights." I drove out myself. The neighborhood sat right against the forest boundary, new houses built where the trees used to be. As soon as I stepped out of the truck, I felt it. That same pressure in my chest, the same absence of response. No insects, no wind, no distant traffic noise. Streetlights glowed steadily, but the shadows beneath them stretched at the wrong angles. Not toward the forest, toward the houses. The woman who called stood on her porch, arms wrapped around herself. "It feels like night shouldn't be here yet," she said. I asked if anyone was missing. She shook her head. "No," she said, "but it feels like something is waiting for someone to stop moving." That sentence ended any doubt. The silent shadows hadn't crossed the boundary had moved. Over the next week, reports increased. Not disappearances, not sightings, sensations. People describing rooms that felt too still, backyards where sound died abruptly, cars that felt harder to start when parked near trees. Every report shared one detail. The silence didn't arrive suddenly. It settled, like a suggestion. We tried closing roads, reducing access, increasing patrols. None of it mattered. The silent shadows weren't expanding geographically. They were expanding behaviorally. They didn't need dense forest anymore. They needed hesitation, and humans provide plenty of that. The worst incident happened on October 27th, the second to last night of the month. A man named Robert Keene didn't return home from his evening walk. His route never entered the forest. It circled his block. We found him standing at the edge of his driveway, upright, eyes open, breathing. His porch light was on. His house door was unlocked behind him. He had stopped 3 steps from safety. When I spoke to him, his response was slow but clear. "I just needed a minute," he said. It was finally quiet. That night we issued the first warning we'd ever shared outside the department, not publicly, quietly. We told people not to walk alone after sunset, not to linger near tree lines, not to stay still if the night felt unusually calm. We couldn't explain why. We didn't need to. People understood more than we expected. October ended the next morning. The silence retreated. Sound returned to places that had forgotten it. The silent shadows withdrew, not defeated, satisfied. Because they'd proven something. They didn't need the forest. They only needed time. After October, everything returned to normal. That was the scariest part. Normal makes people forget. Normal convinces them it was stress, weather, imagination. Only the rangers remembered. Only we knew the rule had changed. The silent shadows weren't tied to land anymore. They were tied to seasons, and eventually, they'd return somewhere else. That's when I understood the final warning we'd been given years ago, written in a ranger's personal notebook from the 1950s. The forest teaches the silence teaches the world. October was ending, but the lesson had already spread. The last warning we were ever given. I didn't plan to tell this story. Forest rangers aren't supposed to talk about things we can't officially explain. We're trained to reduce panic, not create it. But silence only works when it stays contained. And it hasn't. The October after the silent shadows crossed the forest boundary was worse. Not because more people disappeared, but because fewer did. That sounds like progress. It wasn't. There were no dramatic incidents, no mass reports, no clear lines. Instead, there were gaps. Moments where people stopped responding during conversations, where they stood too long in doorways, where they lingered in places that didn't invite rest. The silence had become familiar. That's how it wins. I noticed it in myself first. One evening, months after October ended, I stood in my kitchen after turning off the lights. The house was quiet, not peaceful, intentional. I stayed still longer than I meant to, just listening. That was when I understood the final warning. The silent shadows don't want the forest. They want stillness. The forest was just where they learned how to ask for it. Over the years, we'd thought of them as something external, a condition of land, light, and sound. We were wrong. They're a response. They emerge wherever movement pauses long enough to be replaced by acceptance. That's why they didn't chase, why they didn't attack, why they didn't need darkness. They don't need to take you. They need you to decide not to go. The last ranger meeting before my retirement was quiet. No speeches, no summaries, just one rule written on a whiteboard: never reward the silence. Not with curiosity, not with patience, not with stillness. If something feels wrong because nothing feels wrong, that's the signal. You move, you speak, you leave, because the silent shadows don't create fear. They remove friction, and once the world stops pushing back, people stop pushing forward. That's how places empty without violence. That's how trails close without bodies. That's how people disappear while standing in plain sight. I retired early, moved somewhere loud, somewhere with traffic noise and overlapping conversations and constant interruption. Cities aren't perfect, but they don't let silence settle. Sometimes, late at night, when everything goes quiet at once, I feel it again. That soft suggestion. You can rest now. You don't need to move. I don't listen. I turn on a light. I make noise. I remind the world I'm still here. That's the rule I leave you with. If you're ever somewhere, anywhere, and the quiet feels deliberate, don't try to understand it. Don't appreciate it. Don't stand still long enough for it to notice you noticing it. Move. Because the silent shadows are patient. They don't need forests anymore. They just need people willing to stop. My name is Ethan Cole. I was a forest ranger. We were warned about the silent shadows. Now you are too. End.